history. Was it really anybody's favorite class in high school or college? I mean, sure, you might have been good at it, but was it truly your favorite class? Even though some absolutely insane things have happened over the course of human history, at a certain point it gets a little bit boring to learn about the third iteration of a war that happened 1,000 years ago in Europe because a king, I don't know, didn't get his chicken on time. And yet, even though the majority of our eyes roll over in our head at the idea of learning about the history of the world, when you start talking about fictional history, boy oh boy, do the adults who don't like crowded rooms or loud noises lean forward in their chairs. And as one of those adults myself, boy oh boy, do I love talking fictional history. However, unfortunately, when it comes down to it, a lot of the fictional universes that we interact with, be they anime, live action television shows, or movie series, don't have deeply fleshed out universes that you can dive into the history of. However, in that scenario, Pokemon is absolutely an outlier. See, between the anime, the manga, the video games, the fossil and archaeological records that you can find in said video games, there is a crazy, deep, and rich history to the Pokemon universe that a lot of people don't know about. See, the Pokemon timeline is literally millions of years long, with a beginning that started with a Big Bang-esque event that created an egg that Arceus hatched from, becoming the embodiment of everything in the universe. Pokemon not only has a full-blown creation myth, it has 300 million years of documented history, and yet most fans just know it as that fun new game that drops once a year with semi-disappointing results that gives you 100 new little pocket monsters to catch. And thus today, I want to elucidate the rich history of the Pokemon universe to you, either to you, the diehard Pokemon fan, who already knows everything I'm going to say and is actually going to watch this video with a pen and a paper so they can point out to me every single thing I say wrong, or either to you, on the opposite end of the spectrum, the casual Pokemon player who just wants to know more about the universe. Either way, when it comes down to it, there is so much to learn about the Pokemon universe, and today I hope to teach you everything you need to know about it, because today we're talking the entire timeline of the Pokemon universe explained. But before we get to explaining 300 million years of history in under 30 minutes, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you're looking for one additional Nick video a week, guys, you can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. We just finished the Land of Waves arc, and we're heading to the Chunin exams. So, about 7 or so months ago, I posted a video explaining the entire creation myth of the Pokemon universe. It's 20 minutes long, and I would consider it the precursor to this video. However, under the assumption that some of you haven't seen that, I will briefly go over how the Pokemon universe was created. However, instead of a cosmic explosion out of nothing that expands a universe infinitely, a singular egg, because all Pokemon comes from eggs, comes into being, and that egg is the egg of Arceus, the god of all Pokemon. Arceus then creates the creation trio: Dialga, who's in charge of all of the space in the universe, Palkia, who's in control of all of the time in the universe, and Giratina, who's in charge of all of the antimatter in the universe. However, Giratina is incredibly destructive and kind of a dick, and so Arceus bans Giratina to the Distortion world, a separate universe, which allows for Dialga and Palkia to focus on their day jobs, which is creating all inhabitable universes. And thus they create the Pokemon worlds and then dip back to their own dimensions. Yes, they both have their own sub-dimensions. Arceus then creates 3 more Pokemon who later become known as the Lake Trio: Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelef, with Uxie being in charge of all knowledge, Mesprit in charge of all emotion, and Azelef in charge of all willpower. And these 3 Pokemon are supposed to share these 3 characteristics with all living beings in the Pokemon universe. After this, Kyogre and Groudon are formed by the primal energies of the Pokemon world, specifically in the Hoenn region, and proceed to fill the Pokemon world with all of its land and water. However, one day, while they're both either trying to cover the entire world in land or water, they meet each other at, let's say, a beach, and the 2 of them immediately hate each other. However, fortunately from the world, Rayquaza was also created from the primal energies of the Pokemon world before it was inhabited by other Pokemon and humans, and thus Rayquaza, who's kind of the leader of this legendary trio, quells the battle between Groudon and Kyogre, leading both Groudon and Kyogre to retreat back to their special specific caves, while Rayquaza flies around the planet, protecting the planet from meteors. Now at this time, there's not a huge diversity in the Pokemon that exist on Earth. In fact, it's believed that pretty much the only Pokemon that existed on Earth at this time was Mew, but they were plentiful and kind of everywhere. This is why Mew is often referred to as the the primordial Pokemon. After this, Regigigas is made, and Regigigas walks around pushing the landmasses created by Groudon into specific shapes that later become the continents and regions that we play on in the Pokemon world. But really, what's identified as the first ever landmass created in the Pokemon world is Mount Coronet, and thus the Sinnoh region, which is developed around Mount Coronet, is kind of the first ever region created in the Pokemon world. However, because pushing landmasses around into the shapes of continents is kind of a super hard and violent thing to do, Stark Mountain is created by the shifting of the tectonic plates forced by Regigigas, and under Stark Mountain in a pool of lava, Heatran is created. And thus, as we know it, the world is currently just kind of filled with legendaries and mystic Pokemon. That is to say that the biodiversity of the Pokemon world hasn't necessarily picked up yet. But that is kind of the most Spark Notes possible version of what the Pokemon creation myth is, which is all information that we get from mythology in either the Hoenn or Sinnoh regions. But like I said, if you guys want a way more in-depth preview into what the creation myth of Pokemon looks like, go ahead and watch my previous video. Anyways, with the creation myth out of the way, we can now start talking about identifiable history. Now, all of the history that we know about what we'll identify as the prehistoric Pokemon era is based off the study of fossils, archaeological remains, or scientific studies that we interact with over the course of playing the video games. Now, it's important to note here that any dates I give to you are dates that occur prior to Gen 1, but also to Gen 3, because Gen 1 and Gen 3 happen simultaneously. Anyways, moving on. The earliest known prehistoric Pokemon that we know of existed 300 million years pre-Gen 1. We'll call it PG-1. Now, in this era of 300 million PG-1, the Mew population began to decrease. Remember earlier when I said that really the only Pokemon that were inhabiting the world prior to the biodiversity bloom of all of the other Pokemon evolving over the hundreds of million years PG-1 were Mews? Well, yeah, that's because they were. However, as more and more Pokemon popped up, less and less Mew were around. Now, the oldest, that is to say earliest known prehistoric Pokemon that existed 300 million years ago were Genesect's original version, Kabutops and Kabuto. Now, I say original version of Genesect because the Genesect that we know isn't actually what Genesect should look like. See, Genesect is an ancient Pokemon that was modified by Team Plasma, which is why we have things like Douse Drive, Shock Drive, Burn Drive, and Chill Drive Genesect. However, it didn't always have a cannon on its back, and that's how it existed 300 million years PG-1. On top of that, during this era, Kabuto and Kabutops actually lived in the sea, which is why Kabuto and Kabutops are a dual-type Pokemon with rock and water types. The next oldest Pokemon we know about is Carbink. As somewhere between 300 million and 100 million PG-1, it was born from incredibly powerful, deep underground temperatures and pressures. And this is kind of the cool part about the Pokemon universe. See, while a lot of the legendaries and the mystical Pokemon were created by Arceus, a lot of Pokemon were either created through evolution or environmental factors, mirroring very closely human history. Now, it's not until about 100 million years PG-1 that we really start to see a bloom of Pokemon, as at 100 million PG-1, we saw a huge diversity of Pokemon come into existence. Those being Pokemon like Omastar, Aerodactyl, Lilip, Rampardos, Shieldon, Tortuga, and a ton of other Pokemon. However, supposedly all of the Pokemon who did pop up 100 million years PG-1 eventually went extinct, which is surprising because all of the Pokemon of this era were noted to be incredibly widespread. And this makes sense because as it currently stands, the Pokemon world was not nearly as biodiverse as it is in the modern day, yet there was just as many resources and the planet was just as large. However, before all of the Pokemon that popped up 100 million years PG-1 went extinct, Arkin, or its evolution Archeops, gave rise to all bird Pokemon. Yes, you're hearing me correctly. Literally, all bird Pokemon in the Pokemon universe, everything from Corviknight to Pidgeotto, ties its roots back to Arkin. And not to be outshined, Tortuga actually is the progenitor of all turtle-based Pokemon in the Pokemon universe. And while that's certainly less Pokemon than all of the bird Pokemon in Pokemon, that's still Pokemon like Blastoise, Torkoal, Torterra, all the way to Shuckle and Dreadnought. But these two weren't the only progenitors that existed in this era, as Anorith was also one of the Pokemon that came to be in this 100 million year PG-1 era, said to have existed in the ancient seas alongside Kabuto and Kabutops. Anorith, and therefore most likely its evolution Armaldo, not only existed in this time, but also went extinct, but still paved the way for all bug-type Pokemon, which is a way bigger cast of Pokemon than either bird or turtles. I mean, objectively less useful Pokemon, but still bigger cast. On top of this, for those of you who remember Gen 8 with any modicum of love, maybe you'll remember that the fossilized Drake, Dino, Bird, and Fish fossils also came from this era of 100 million PG1. And thus, the combination of all of these four fossils, that being Draktyzolt, Arctozolt, Dracofish, and Arctofish, also all existed in this era. But as you may have deduced, like all the other Pokemon from this era, they went extinct, which is why they're fossils that we now have to jam together to remake. Well, maybe not anymore. They have been in Gen 8 and Gen 9, but who's to say they're going to be in Gen 10? Now, after the era of 100 million PG1, we have a big jump all the way to 2 million PG1. See, it's believed in 2 million PG1 that the Area Zero Underdepths were created. See, the Area Zero Underdepths existed in the Great Crater in Paldea, aka Gen 9. Now, these underdepths were created by seismic shifts. Now, these seismic shifts and the cave-in of the Great Paldean Crater almost led to the extinctions of the Terapagos, which is historically and I guess chronologically the first Terra Pokemon. Now, Terapagos is the first Terra Pokemon, that is to say the first Pokemon that's able to terrestrialize, because when the seismic shifts 2 million years PGI were wiping out the Terapagos, one of the Terapagos actually pulled all of its energy back into its body and formed its body into that of a crystal in order to survive the pressure of the seismic shifts. And thus this one crystallized Terapagos survived in the Area Zero Underdepths until we find it in Gen 9. Now after that, we have another huge jump to 20,000 years PG1, the time period when Eternatus, the final legendary from Gen 8, fell into the Galar region on a meteorite, thus making Eternatus the first Eternamax Pokemon on the Pokemon world, but also confirming that there are other worlds on the Pokemon universe that have Pokemon, and that world probably has some pretty scary Pokemon, as Eternatus, outside of being the core of the Eternamax phenomenon, the Galar region, on account of it leaking out its Galar particles that other people are able to collect and use that energy to Eternamax their own Pokemon, is also the tallest base form Pokemon known to man. Now, Eternatus falling to the earth in the Galar region does kind of screw over the Galar region for a couple of thousand years, until two human children, Zaki and Zamazenta, stop the darkest day in the Galar region, which is a day of infamy in the Galar region, because it was the day that the Galar region became so overrun with the Galar particles released by Eternatus that Pokemon all over the Galar region just started Dynamaxing left, right, and center. But fortunately, like I said, the two kids with the combined forces of Zacian and Zamazenta are able to defeat Eternatus and thus save the Galar region, something that you do again in Gen 8. However, at the end of Gen 8, you don't get crowned as the new king of the region, which is what the two kids got after they defeated Eternatus 3,000 years ago. So we get kind of robbed. But that's not until 3,000 years PG1, so we're way ahead of ourselves here. Let's hop back to 10,000 years PG1, when the Pokemon world was dealing with its last known Ice Age, which yes, coincides with Earth's last known Ice Age. They didn't get that creative. Also, it is several days later. That was a Friday afternoon, it's now Monday morning. I had stuff to do. I played Half Sword all weekend. Anyways, 10,000 years PG1, Mama Swine were one of the most common Pokemon in existence, you know, because they're basically woolly mammoths. On top of this is when Cyclozars and humans began to have a symbiotic relationship, living alongside humans and being ridden by humans so that the humans could get places and the Cyclozars could be warmed up. But really, the most important thing that happens during this time period revolves around Regigigas and the rest of the Regis. See, because it's around 10,000 years PG1, creates 3 and then 2 additional golems made in its own image. Those being Regirock, Regice, Registeel, and then at a later date, because Pokemon needed more Regis, Regieleki and Regidrago. Obviously, Regigigas was responsible for molding the continents into the shapes that they currently exist as, but all of these golems were made to manage the elements of the earth that they were made out of. However, because the thing that made the continents is now making golems in its own shape that can manage entire elemental concepts, humans got a bit scared of Regigigas. So somehow they sealed it away inside of the Snow Point Temple in the Sinnoh region because everybody was really cool with the continents as they were. They didn't want Regigigas getting any ideas about rearranging the furniture. Similarly, Regirock, Regice, and Registeel were all sealed away at other various points, either in the Hoenn, Sinnoh, or Galar regions, with Regieleki and Regidrago also being sealed away in the Galar region. Now, somewhere between 10,000 PG1 and 3,000 PG1, befriended befriended 10 Pokemon, and with the help of those 10 Pokemon, collected each and every single one of Arceus's plates. Now, for those of you who don't know what Arceus's plates are, they're a concept that was introduced in Gen 4, and basically every single one of the now 19 plates is the core of all of the moves of the type that that plate represents. That's kind of confusing, so let me break it down for you. There was 16 plates introduced in Gen 4. Plates like the Fist Plate or the Sky Plate. Now, something like the Fist Plate is technically the inception of all fighting type moves on the Pokemon world. Something like the Sky Plate is the inception of all of the flying type moves. Now, whenever Arceus is seen, it's surrounded by a ring of these plates. And that's because Arceus is technically a representation of everything in the universe. Arceus has access to every single move that has ever existed, and these plates are where that power is stored. Anyways, this ancient hero, alongside their 10 befriended Pokemon, after collecting what was at the time all 16 of Arceus's plates, but later got revealed to be 19 because more typings kept being dropped, were able to not only reach Arceus, but also defeat it in combat. And thus, the 10 Pokemon that were able to defeat Arceus, their literal god, mind you, would not only be worshipped, but also their descendants would be worshipped by people who lived in the Hisui region. And those 10 Pokemon would not only receive blessings from Arceus, but also be known as either Ride or Noble Pokemon for the rest of their history. With the Ride Pokemon being Pokemon you could ride, and the Noble Pokemon being Pokemon granted the task of looking over the people of the Hisui region. Now, after this ambiguous time period of defeating gods, we get to 3,000 years PG1, where we get to the Darkest Day, which was created by the Eternamax Eternatus, which required the two human youths, their Zacian and their Zamazenta, smack the Eternatus around and make everything stop Dynamaxing. We already talked about it. I just wanted to remind you that we already talked about it and that we're at that time period now. Smash cut to 2,000 years PG1. We're getting close. And this isn't an important piece of information, but it is one of my favorite. 2,000 years before Gen 1, Conkeldurr teaches humans how to create concrete using centrifugal force. Yeah, you heard it here first. Somehow, Conkeldurr, which mind you, can only exist when traded, as it evolves from Girder into its final form when traded, after somehow achieving its final form, decided, you know what? Let's reinvent human construction. And listen, I'm not the only one who ever thought it was weird that Girder has a steel I-beam, but Conkeldurr has concrete. I get it. I understand. Timber has wood. You start building with wood. Then you put your steel in, which is like your rebar. And then you finish with concrete, which is Conkeldurr. We all know that steel is stronger than concrete, right? But anyways, 2,000 years PG1, while Conkeldurr was teaching people how to smash rocks together and turn them into a really strong liquid, the Hoenn region starts getting hit by a ton of meteors, which is crazy because what's Rayquaza doing up there? And thus the home place of the Draconoid people who live in the Hoenn region and worship Rayquaza as their dragon lord turns into Meteor Falls. However, because of all these meteors that are falling to the earth, the world begins to overflow with natural energy, and thus Primal Groudon and Primal Kyogre begin to clash, as they both want this energy to either cover the entire world in land or cover the entire world in sea. However, because nobody was a big fan of the war between the thing that can cover the entire world in ocean and the thing that can cover the entire world in land, Draconoid people summoned Rayquaza using a meteor that had fallen to the earth and asked Rayquaza to stop this battle between Groudon and Kyogre, and thus Rayquaza put the both of them to sleep, and thus the Draconoid people worshipped Rayquaza for the rest of their time. Smash cut to 1,500 years PG1, and the earliest known system of writing is developed in the Pokemon world. Yes, they've only known how to write for 1,500 years. They have Rotom-powered cell phones, but they've only known how to write for 1,500 years. But then again, when you don't have to worry about manual labor or some of your own scientific advancements because Pokemon can just teach you how to do them, or generating electricity without the help of Pokemon, it would make sense that the Industrial Revolution would happen just a bit faster. Anyways, this earliest known form of writing is the form of writing that's used in the runes of Alph, the Tanabe runes, and the Salacian runes. And this earliest ever form of writing is nearly identical to the Unknown. You know, the floating symbol Pokemon, of which there's 28 of, to represent every letter between A and Z, and then an exclamation point and a question mark. And as wild as it sounds, the archaeologists of the Pokemon universe don't know if the existence of the Unknown superseded or preceded the existence of human writing. That is to say that either the entire written language of the Pokemon universe is based off the Unknown, or somehow, some way, when humans create created written language, the Unknown came to be. There's a reason they're called the Unknown, and it's because we know basically nothing about them. Smash cut to 1,000 years PG1, and Groudon and Kyogre are still being really pissed at each other. Because 1,000 years after the events of Meteor Falls, another primal energy meteor strikes the Earth. Specifically, the Hoenn region. Once again, Rayquaza, do your job. Now, this primal energy meteor strikes the Earth so hard that it creates the crater that actually later becomes Suitopolis City. And once again, Groudon and Kyogre awake from their slumber, pissed that the other person might get that primal energy. And once again, the people of the Hoenn region pray to Rayquaza and wish that Rayquaza would stop Kyogre and Groudon's eternal battle. And Rayquaza, who's probably sick of their shit, performs the world's first ever Mega Evolution. And so he smacks Garchomp Plus and Wailmer Plus, and after defeating the two of them, strips them of their primal forms. And once again, for the third time, puts them to sleep. And thus, in order to honor Rayquaza, the Draconoid people build the Sky Pillar and promise Rayquaza to pass down the prophecy that in 1,000 years, the meteor would return and strike Earth, creating the events of the Delta episode, a mission that's unlocked after the completion of either Pokemon Omega Ruby or Alpha Sapphire, which happens after you defeat Steven and enter the Hall of Fame. And thus the player has to revive Rayquaza so Rayquaza can destroy the meteor before it can strike the Earth and reawaken Groudon and Kyogre. It was actually one of the cooler things that Pokemon ever did, and probably my favorite Easter egg of all time. Because after you beat the game, you would have to close the game and then reopen the game to initiate this mission. Smash cut to just a couple of years before Legend of Arceus, which happens a couple of 100 years before Gen 1, mind you. And this is when the Diamond and Pearl clans arrived in the Hisui region, taking on the name of the Celestia people and worshipping what they knew as the Almighty Sinnoh, a god that is either Palkia or Dialga, depending on whether or not you're talking to the Diamond or Pearl clans. But since one of the clans believes that Almighty Sinnoh is the god of space and the other believes that is the god of time, this started a generations-long feud between the two clans. Because ironically, nothing quite divides people like religion. We then smash cut to roughly 300 years PG1, right before the events of Arceus, when Volo seeks out Giratina to have it rip open a space-time rip on top of Mount Coronet in order to drive Dialga and Palkia insane and to drive Arceus out of what Volo believed was hiding. We then hop into the events of the Legends of Arceus, which I'm not gonna go over the entire game, but about 300 years PG1, during the events of the Legends of Arceus, Pokeballs are invented, created collectively from apricorns. Kind of makes the idea that Conkeldurr 2,000 years ago, A, even existed, and B, was able to impart the information of how concrete was created 1,700 years before Pokeballs were even made. How do you trade a Pokemon that's not in a Pokeball? Anyways, in The Legend of Arceus, your main character, who is either Ray or Akari, depending on what gender you go for, is brought from the present to the Hisui region 300 years in the past to seek out all Pokemon and create the first ever Pokedex, which, in Legends of Arceus, contains 238 entries. And while this is happening, you work alongside people like Adaman, Arida, Volo, Kogita to seek out the Lake Guardians, create the Red Chain, weaken Palkia and Dialga, capture them using the Origin Ball, and supposedly save the region from destruction. But in actuality, it just opened the door for Giratina to rip a space-time rift that allows for Arceus to come on down and supposedly be defeated by the combined forces of Volo and Giratina. However, you defeat Volo and Giratina and the world is actually saved. And just like that, Legends of Arceus is behind us. Now smash cut to about 200 years PG1, and the Area Zero expedition team finally reaches the depths of the Great Crater of Paldea, aka Gen 9. And at the bottom of this Great Crater of Paldea, they discover Area Zero for the first time. One of the members of this expedition team decides to write a journal based off the journey of this expedition team down to Area Zero, and in it we learn that the expedition team on this journey discovered not only Paradox Pokemon that fell into two categories depending on whether or not you got Scarlet or Violet, where either the Paradox Pokemon resembled ancient relatives of contemporary Pokemon, or they looked like futuristic relatives of contemporary Pokemon. They also discovered the Herba Mystica, which was an herb found in Area Zero that when eaten by wild Pokemon turned them into Titan Pokemon. And thus the expedition team also found Titan Pokemon, which are just really big versions of regular Pokemon, but they're also defending the Herba Mystica. On top of this, they also discovered the Terastallized Pokemon. Yeah, Scarlet and Violet introduced a lot of different different kinds of Pokemon. Terrestrialized Pokemon, like we talked about a little bit earlier, draw their history back thousands and thousands of years into the past. However, as in order for terrestrialized Pokemon to exist in the first place, they need access to Terra Energy, and only the Shining Crystals found in Area Zero release Terra Energy, and therefore only Pokemon in Area Zero can terrestrialize. Not until the expedition team went down to Area Zero for the first time were they actually found out by humanity. However, once humanity did find terrestrial energy, they started running away with it. So much so that humans were actually able to use terrestrial energy to create a time machine, which is how they were able to get Paradox Pokemon in the first place, which is why we're able to get ancient and futuristic versions of contemporary Pokemon. 50 years later, to roughly 150 PG1, the Brass Tower, which was constructed alongside the Bell Tower 700 years PG1, which are constructed in Ecruteak City, in the Johto region, which were then said to have Lugia and Ho-Oh perched at the top of them, with Lugia being on top of the Brass Tower and Ho-Oh being on top of the Bell Tower. 150 years PG1, the Brass Tower, that is to say the one that Lugia was perched on top of, burns down. Unfortunately, inside of the Brass Tower were 3 nameless Pokemon, and now that Lugia no longer had anywhere to perch, it flew off to the Whirl Islands, which are also in Johto. However, since the Bell Tower had not burned down, Ho-Oh was still there. And thus Ho-Oh actually flies to the remains of the burnt down Brass Tower and revives the 3 killed nameless Pokemon. And these 3 nameless revived Pokemon actually become the legendary beasts: Raikou, Entei, and Suicune. Yeah, Ho-Oh made them. I'm sure a lot of you knew that, but some of you probably didn't. Now, smash cut to what's identified as 1925, because it's important to remember here that the Pokemon universe actually lines up with the real-life universe, and that Gen 1 in the Pokemon universe is actually in 1996 when it releases. So, in the year of 1925, about 250 years after the idea of Pokeballs had been created by using apricorns, modern Pokeballs are actually invented by a person by the name of Professor Westwood from Caldeon University. Now, as to how modern Pokeballs are made, we can't actually really say. We know some more specialized Pokeballs like Moonballs are still made from apricorns. The majority of modern Pokeballs, which are made by companies like Silphco, the Devon Corporation, and the Kalos Pokeball Factory, haven't necessarily told us how modern day Pokeballs are made. However, fun fact, did you know that Pokeballs don't technically shrink Pokemon? We learned in Legends of Arceus that every single Pokemon has the ability to shrink their size to minuscule, and Pokeballs simply take advantage of the ability of Pokemon to do that, which is why they're able to shrink them down to a size that fits in a Pokeball. The next big thing, and kind of the only important thing that happens pre-Gen 1 that we haven't talked about yet, is that in 1969, canonically in the Pokemon universe, humans land on the moon for the first time. Yeah, like I said, the Pokemon universe doesn't always get that creative in how it changes history from the real life world. Oh, and I lied, I'm sorry. In 1995, which is only 1 year before Gen 1, the first ever Pokemon created by scientific engineering, Porygon, is created. And to what purpose was this Porygon created? Well, apparently to give kids seizures. And thus, with that, we are completely caught up to the contemporary history of the Pokemon universe. That is to say that everything after this moment happens in the events of the games of Gen 1 through Gen 9, which I could absolutely go over, but that is for a separate video entirely. But if you guys do want me to go over the complete and total contemporary history of the Pokemon universe, let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, the Celtics are playing. Bye.